Hey guys, so we're looking here today at section 20.3, which as you can see, the title here is Earth's Early History. And you can see with this also, we've got a lot of kind of geological processes being represented here, right? Formation of gases that go up in the atmosphere and lava and magma coming out of our volcanic eruption here, and probably collision of tectonic plates and all sorts of different processes. So when we think about creation of living things in the context of what we've been doing in class in biology, keep in mind a lot of these kind of background things that have been happening that also, touch on other fields of science are relevant to our understanding of how species as a whole and living things as a group started to evolve. Okay, so as always, get the title here, and then we're going to go through just a few slides. This is actually a pretty short section, which is good. So for our objectives here, we have two. First one says, explain what scientists hypothesize about early Earth and the origin of life, and then describe the theory that explains the origin of eukaryotic cells. And eukaryotic cells are something we'll be going back to a little bit to talk about, and in the context of, I believe it's chapter 8, which deals with cell types and organelles and all those other things. But you may remember in the past that you've probably learned eukaryotic cells have membrane-bound organelles. They contain these organelles that help them to kind of divide up the workload of a cell. So they become really important. They are what we are made of. And so more complex organisms in general are typically made of eukaryotic types of cells. All right, and we'll talk about that again here coming up shortly. But when we think about the start of Earth and the beginning of, where we all came from in terms of, where were living things first created and when did that occur and how. Again, we got to step back and kind of consider the evidence that's provided for us. And the issue that we have with that, that scientists have with that, is that this is billions of years old, right? So we're talking about an Earth that is billions upon billions of years old, and that's a number for a lot of us it's hard to kind of even fathom. So what we do know about the Earth is that, or what we think happened with the creation of our planet is, the planet's been in existence for billions of years, but it originally started out as this kind of super volatile, extreme environment type of location with lots of volcanic eruptions and lots of asteroid and meteorite impacts. And as a result of that, the atmosphere, the cloud likely, or the sky off likely looked pretty cloudy and hazy. It likely took on kind of a pinkish color because of all the carbon and hydrogen compounds that were found up in the atmosphere at the time. And importantly, it lacked oxygen. So we didn't have oxygen in the earliest atmospheres that made up the Earth. But over time, as the Earth kind of began to cool, which happened, scientists think around 4 billion years ago, 4.2 billion years ago or so. At that point, it became more habitable, right? So a lot of this kind of extreme stuff that was happening started to kind of calm down. Lava cooled, right? That started to form rock. And as we started to get rock, we also then created things like bodies of water. As precipitation formed from those compounds up in the atmosphere, water started to condense, right? And it reached the Earth's surface. And so we started forming oceans and lakes and rock beds and other structures like that. And as a result of that, then we had places where living things could kind of start to begin to thrive. So when we think about how living things first came into being, a couple of scientists a while back, about a century ago at this point, this is in the 1950s, set up an experiment that is still pretty well known. It's called the Miller-Urey experiment, and Miller and Urey were the two names of these two scientists. And so what they did is they tried to kind of simulate and assess whether or not it's possible to create molecules that are important for living things, molecules that make up things like proteins, nucleic acids, which are DNA and RNA, carbohydrates, which are like sugars, what we use for energy primarily, and lipids, which we know we also can use for energy. And so what they did in setting up this experiment is they were trying to simulate this early atmosphere of the Earth and tried to include, the compounds that we had present then. So we know that water was in existence, even if it was just simply as a gas up in the atmosphere, but water was present. And so what they did is they set up this apparatus like this, and they ran this experiment for about a week. So what this required is a water bath here that was heated. And as that heated, that formed a water vapor. And then they had, in that same area, they had gases that were being added into this tube right here, like ammonia, like carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, other types of gases that we know were present in the atmosphere at that time. So those kind of got pumped in here to this whole experimental setup. And then what they did is they simulated lightning. They simulated lightning by providing sparks of energy, sparks of electricity coming from these coil systems here. And so those sparks, again, were supposed to kind of present themselves as if it was lightning on the Earth's surface. And then as that happened, as I mentioned, Earth starts to kind of cool. And as that water vapor cools off and begins to form water droplets, liquid water, those droplets were then kind of quantified and they were assessed in terms of what they were made up of. So after about a week, as I said, they collect the water and then they assess what's present. And so what they were looking for were, again, those molecules that I mentioned before that we know are important in living things. So proteins, DNA, RNA, carbohydrates, and lipids. And what they found was something amazing, actually, which is that they were able to discover that there were really all of the amino acids that we make in living things were created in this kind of simple experimental setup. So yes, it did seem probable that we could start with simple things like the gases up in the atmosphere, like CO2 and ammonia, NH3, or in combination with that, add in water vapor, and some energy in the form of lightning and create some really kind of unique molecules. And this is something that, back at the time was pretty revolutionary. Now we know, based on astronomical type of data, that these amino acids, which are what make up our proteins, so the protein type molecules that were created here, are also created out in space through chemical reactions involving things like asteroids and meteorites. And so this is not completely unusual to consider that would be happening here on the Earth's surface back 4.2 billion years ago. So one of the things that they were able to kind of come up with as a result of their experiments, what other scientists added to this was that it appeared as if among those molecules that we know are important for living things, and I mentioned already DNA is part of it, RNA is similar to DNA, and we'll if you remember, RNA is something that's called ribonucleic acid. So truly RNA's job in comparison to DNA is that RNA doesn't actually store genetic information right now. RNA's job in our cells, as we exist as living things, is simply to transfer genetic information from the nucleus of a cell, that control center of a cell, to different parts. And so as part of that process, there was a lot of assessment going on with these experiments, these early experiments about early life forms on Earth. And data that was obtained from those kind of pointed towards this idea that RNA was actually present before DNA became kind of relevant to living things. And so what we see here, and this is kind of that sequence of events that would have represented a life form that contained RNA before it created DNA. So again, if you start with inorganic matter, which simply means things that are not found in living things, so molecules not found in living things. So again, when I guess I should repeat that and say that differently. So inorganic things can be found in living things. It's just inorganic matter isn't typically carbon based. So like water is an inorganic molecule. Ammonia and ammonium are inorganic molecules. Nitrates and nitrites, sulfates and sulfites, those are all inorganic materials. They are important for living things, all right, but they're inorganic because they're not carbon based, okay? So when we think about that inorganic matter, creating these simple organic molecules through the experiment we saw on the last slide, RNA nucleotides are kind of part of that. These are tiny molecules that can be created through that same process. And what we've learned about RNA since the time of these experiments, 50 to 100 years ago, is that RNA can copy itself. RNA can be used to make proteins, and RNA can help with information storage. Now, it's generally not a long-term storage type molecule, but there are viruses, including COVID-19, that function truly with the help of RNA. They don't have DNA. Their entire viral genome, all the genes that makes them who they are as a virus, is stored within RNA molecules. So RNA definitely can store information. All right, and then from that we can create some DNA, from that we can create protein, and from that we can create these enzymes or specific types of proteins that help to catalyze and speed up chemical reactions. And so in thinking about, how living things developed, it becomes important to understand and remember here that RNA is going to be one of our starting points. Okay. Now, eukaryotic cells, I mentioned, we're going to come back to that. So here's part of that. So with a eukaryotic cell, these are cells that are membrane bound, which means not only do they have a membrane here on the outside that separates them from the outside environment, but they also contain organelles here, like the mitochondrion, and what is probably kind of a primitive nucleus here, organelles that are separated from the rest of the cytoplasm and from other organelles inside the cell. So those little organelles have membranes. All right, this one's not fully formed yet, but in a fully functional eukaryotic cell for a living thing that's existing right now, like in my body or in your body, these things would be much more complex. There's lots of different membrane-bound organelles in that cytoplasm. So if this is a primitive eukaryote, right, what we're looking at is just a few things. The other type of cell besides eukaryotes that we have in terms of our living things right now is called prokaryotes. And those prokaryotes lack a nucleus. They also lack membrane-bound organelles. They kind of just look like this. They're like little empty spaces. They do contain DNA, and they can have some stuff on the outside of their cells. But beyond that, there's not a lot inside. They basically have nucleic acid, which is DNA. They have ribosomes, and they have cytoplasm. Okay. So the thought here in looking at this slide is that when we went to, create a living thing, it's likely that those simple, less complex cells were developed first, right? So these would be my ancient bacteria right here. And then in order to get to the point where we have these eukaryotic cells that contain organelles with membranes surrounding them, what likely happened is this process called endosymbiosis. What that essentially means is something becomes part of something else. It starts to live within something else. So in this case, the idea was we had this ancient larger prokaryote, and we had this ancient smaller prokaryote, which is a type of bacteria. And this larger one basically surrounded and pulled the smaller one in towards it. Okay. And as it did that, that smaller thing became specific in terms of what it did for that cell, like it worked with it in a way. All right. In other words, it became beneficial to have this little thing on the inside of the cell because that little thing made it better and easier for the cell to do its own job and to survive. So it's likely that some of the first bacteria that were kind of absorbed by these old eukaryotes became the mitochondrion. And the mitochondrion's job is to make energy for a cell. The mitochondrion is thought to be one of the first because a mitochondrion also contains its own set of DNA, which is pretty cool. Mitochondria in humans are only inherited and passed down from moms to their kids. Dads and male parents never pass down their mitochondria to their offspring. And so there's a whole subset of genetic disorders and diseases that are strictly based on problems with that mitochondrial DNA, and it's always tracked to the mom. Okay, so the mitochondrion here likely came from this. In addition, they probably also started to pull in other types of cells, and here they're supposed to represent, we've got chloroplasts that are forming here to create photosynthetic organisms, things that can create their own energy using sunlight. And then for those cells that didn't kind of take in what would become those chloroplasts, they diverged down here along this lower line and became animals and other things that are consumers, not producers. So in looking at, this whole process of how we created lots of different living things, and I'm saying we, but truly, we're talking about these natural events that occurred on the earth. So again, the thought was a couple of things. Earth starts out without any oxygen. Living things are created through basically, simple chemical reactions happening between inorganic molecules like water and the other gases up in the atmosphere. And with those molecules that get created, they start to get assembled in different ways. And so RNA, again, is one of those molecules that we tend to think we started with. And from that, we started to build these structures around it. All right, our prokaryotic cells, which are the simple bacterial cells, and then the eukaryotic cells that make up more complex living things. And so the RNA that we find in those earliest cells, the idea is that it probably became part of what we call the ribosome, and the ribosome's job is to make proteins. The ribosome itself is actually the only organelle that's truly not membrane bound. It simply consists of proteins and RNA that works together, and that's it. Like, it doesn't have any other structure, any other molecule that makes it up. It's pretty much just RNA and then those accessory proteins that help it out. So the thought is that that original RNA probably becomes a ribosome. And then those ribosomes, every time a cell divides, get passed down to the next cell and the next cell and the next cell. Proteins get added as part of this process to help improve efficiency with that ribosome, right? To help the RNA become more functional. Because RNA itself is really just like a molecule. It doesn't have a whole lot of ability of making a chemical reaction happen. It's just kind of there, right? So the proteins would help with that. We also know that some of the structures that we see in prokaryotes that are living today, like this bacterial cell here, again, it's prokaryotic, so you can see it's pretty simple, but they have some structures that seem to kind of indicate that proteins can be produced and used and remade and passed down and so on and so forth. And the structures that they're emphasizing here in this image are called flagella. So these are these long whip-like tails, and it looks like this bacterial cell has 4 of them. But those protein subunits can come from different parts of the cell, and they can be broken down and reassembled into creating structures like this. So in other words, cells are pretty fluid. They have the ability to kind of modify structures. They have the ability to modify information in a way that promotes survival, okay? And so when we think about this whole process of, starting with nothing essentially and creating living forms that are super complex and involved and even difficult for us and our giant smart brains to try and understand, there was a whole lot that had to happen, and it had to happen correctly, right? And so the process was certainly not as simple as we're making it sound here in 20.3, but that being said, I don't need you to know a whole bunch of detail about it, okay? The one piece that was left off here was that additional piece about oxygen. So the last little part I should mention is that for these cells that are going through this process, that are creating these organelles, that are starting to kind of separate out specific functions and assign those to specific locations in the cell, oxygen is probably being released by some of those as they start to kind of identify how they can make their own energy. And so for those cells that became photosynthetic, well, one of the major products that we get out of photosynthesis is actually oxygen. And so that oxygen is going to be starting to be released by those photosynthetic organisms, by those autotrophs. And those autotrophs are essentially adding that up in the atmosphere. And so the majority of the oxygen we see now up in the atmosphere, the reason why we're here and we can actually be aerobic and breathe in and breathe out like that is thanks to really those photoautotrophs that kind of kickstarted the whole process. Okay. All right, so that's all I have for section 20.3 as usual. Let me know if you've got any questions. Otherwise, I will see you next time. Bye, y'all.